For much of the 2023-2024 NHL season, the Oilers' defense was their big question mark. Now, with Ty Emberson in the fold, what does the former San Jose Shark bring to the table?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. So, today's episode, I promised it earlier in the week. I like doing these evaluations because they get me in the minutia, they get me down in the weeds, and they really let me sift through identifying how a player plays, what makes them tick, what makes them effective, what their strengths, what their weaknesses are. And today, we are doing an entire episode dedicated to Ty Emberson, the presumptive sixth defenseman on the Oilers this upcoming NHL season. So I like to do these evals in a variety. I like to use a variety of tools when I'm putting together a player evaluation. And I do think it's important I walk you through my methodology. So our outset, we're going to talk about the methodology, how I put together a scouting report, what tools I use, how I come to them. We're going to talk about Emberson specifically, his pedigree, his development, his background. Our second segment, we're going to tackle his NHL development so far, what he's done, not a lot, only 30 career NHL games. And then our final segment, we're going to talk about what the Oilers might have seen, what they may be able to do with him that he wasn't able to do in San Jose. So at the outset, player evaluation of any kind in any sport, it is not an exact science because no two players are exactly the same. There's a level of nuance that goes into player evaluation that a lot of people just aren't going to be able to put the time into they aren't going to be able to put the time into developing a unique opinion. That's why when you watch draft coverage on TV, whatever sport, the tool that they will use on TV, the panel will use, is a comparison. They will refer to a player that is about to get drafted into whatever league, similar skill set to this guy who used to be in the NHL or in the NFL. You know, you look at the comparisons for somebody. I'll give you the famous one, the silly one. If you all remember Cole Caulfield getting drafted a handful of years ago, and then NBCSN flashing a graphic comparing him to Leo Messi. Obviously, the comparison there was about their size and their playmaking. And when you talk about comparisons, I don't think when you use comparisons for a player evaluation, I think that's the simplest way and it's the most relatable way for somebody to form an opinion and to give them an understanding of how someone plays. But it's never going to work exactly. And I hate to use like Facebook or fortune cookie logic here, but that's what this is, what I'm about to say. You can't compare everybody on the same scale because you can't ask a fish to climb a tree. You can't ask an elephant to sing a song. There are different players have different expectations based on a variety of factors, their physical traits, their development cycle, their background, what developmental leagues they played in. All of that goes into forming a baseline of expectation. You know, what you expect from the 4th overall pick is not the same thing you would expect from the 84th overall pick. There's a level of nuance and understanding that goes into putting this together. So the traits I look for when I am evaluating a player, the single most important trait, the highest peak, if you're looking at if we're thinking of a pyramid right at the peak, to me, the single most important thing we can talk about is a player's instincts and positioning. You don't have to be a great skater if you have strong positioning. I always point to Adam Fox, the defenseman of the New York Rangers, former Norris Trophy winner. Adam Fox is not a great straight line skater. He's pretty slow by NHL standards, but he always knows where he needs to be. He has elite positioning and he has great hockey instincts. That is something that you really can't teach. It can get better over time with more repetitions, especially for defensemen. We see that defensemen typically develop slower than forwards because the development cycle is a little bit longer because of the volume of repetitions that go into developing what your skill set is. Reading your angles, reading your gaps, knowing when to turn around, put your back to the forecheckers to go back and get the puck versus backward skating, trying to block the lanes. All of that goes into it. So we're talking, as far as the things I'm looking at, positioning and instincts is number one. Number two is decision making. And decision making flows off of instincts, but there is this notion in today's NHL that we want to play as efficiently as possible. And that might not necessarily complement everybody's skill sets. There are plenty of teams that are asking guys to do things they're not particularly good at. And how players cope or deal with the situation around them and understanding how to process the game, it feeds off of positioning and instincts, but processing the game, being able to make split-second decisions, knowing where the puck needs to go, that is imperative. And again, like positioning, if you have strong decision-making, that can mitigate some other factors. If you're not a great skater, if you don't have great puck skills, but you make good decisions, you can prolong your NHL career. Then I have skating and agility where even if you're empty-headed, you make bad decisions, per se, like Cody Ceci, Mike Matheson. There are plenty of defensemen who are strong skaters who don't have good positioning, who don't make good decisions, but their skating, their agility keeps them in the NHL level. Then I have puck skills where you get the puck where it needs to go. You have the ability to walk the blue line if you're a defenseman. If you're a forward, it means being able to thread the puck through traffic. I have shooting on this list as well. Shooting, not particularly important for a defenseman. And then the last thing I have is physicality. Although I'm not a big proponent of the big hulking defenseman, they do typically do a better job of retrieving pucks, getting it to their partner who's a little more ambulatory, able to move the puck a little bit more, and blocking shots, blocking shots, hits to a lesser extent. But the biggest thing for me when it comes to physicality is, can you win puck battles? Because when I think of functional toughness, that's the most important trait in hockey as far as toughness to me. If you can win your puck battles, whether you're a defenseman below your own goal line after a dump in, or you're a winger along the boards trying to scoop one out, if you win your battles because you know how to use your body, think about the way Sidney Crosby has reinvented himself. Nobody is going to think Sidney Crosby is a tough guy, but he has functional utilitarian toughness where he is able to use the shape of his body. He's able to get low. He's able to create leverage and win puck battles. That's what you got to do in today's league as far as functional toughness. And then Emberson, real quick. I've covered this at points over the last few weeks, but a refresher. 3rd round pick back in 2018. Spent his developmental years pre-draft in the National Development Team program in the USHL, where guys like Caulfield, Zegras, etc. have spent their developmental time. They play against USHL teams. Emberson went to college, 3 years at the University of Wisconsin, drafted by the Coyotes prior to going to college, 3 years in college, 3 years in the AHL, 2 with the Tucson Roadrunners, 1 with the Hartford Wolfpack, and this past season with 30 games with the San Jose Sharks. He's listed at 6'2", 193 pounds, and I think Emberson is a good example of the slow play that defensemen have. If you're in that National Development Team program, you got eyes. You are playing with really talented forwards who are going to put up counting stats, who are going to get eyes on you, where just by you being on the team with those guys is going to give you more opportunities than somebody playing in the WHL or the QMJHL or the OHL or European League. If you are on that National Development Team program, because USA Hockey has such a strong foothold in front offices across the NHL, it does open doors for you. And Emberson, going from Arizona, who has a connection to USA Hockey, to the Rangers, who have a very strong connection to USA Hockey, to the Sharks, who have a very strong connection to USA Hockey, it makes sense. The Oilers don't have that direct tie to USA Hockey, but Ty Emberson has ties to Chris Knobloch, who is with the Rangers, who have that strong tie to USA Hockey. So, and when I say Rangers, I mean the Wolfpack, their AHL affiliate. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to talk about Ty Emberson's results last year with the Sharks, who he played with, his quality of competition, the facets of his game, what he's good at, what he's not. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. It might be the end of summer, but we still have a little bit left in baseball season and concert season. And if you're like me and you've been out there this summer, going to games, going to shows, I went to Creed last week. I had a great experience singing Arms Wide Open with the boys. tremendous. Next week, Tuesday, the 3rd of September, seeing Pearl Jam. Very much looking forward to that. And the only place I buy tickets to go to games, to go to shows, from our friends over at Gametime, with some of the best features in the ticket buying business. Things like Seat View, where you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. So if you're going to a show and you want to get an idea of your view of the stage, or you're going to a baseball game, you want to be able to see home plate so you can get a feel for balls and strikes, that is essential to me. The lowest price guarantee, where Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference if you find a better deal. All-in pricing, where you toggle it on right at the start, and it shows you the price entirely. No surprise fees at checkout before you go to checkout. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insights on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, continuing on our conversation, talking about Ty Emberson, I do think it's important that when we do a player evaluation, which we're doing right now, we use context, because context is imperative in understanding what a player's expectations are and how realistic it is for them to meet their expectations. And that's why we in the I say we, but in the analytics and the stats community, we like to use rate statistics, where we compare players over 60 minutes of ice time to mitigate for the fact that players have different amounts of ice time. You know, it's not fair to compare the workload of a third pair defenseman who has really good underlying numbers to a first pair defenseman who plays a lot more. That's why you put stats over a 60-minute scale, to give everybody a reasonable sample size to work with. So there is a conundrum here, and this is real. And Emberson only having 30 games of NHL experience does mean that a lot of these stats are not a full-scale understanding. That, typically speaking, when we want to evaluate a player, especially at the NHL level, we like at least 100 to 200 games of NHL experience before we start to, okay, that's who this guy is. Because those early stages, typically, if we're not dealing with a top 10 pick, if we're talking about a guy's first foray into the NHL, there's going to be kind of a winding road. If you're a defenseman, you got to trickle your way in. You're a seventh guy, you're a sixth guy, you sit for a week, you get back in the lineup, and it can be challenging to really get your footing at the outset of your NHL career, especially as somebody who doesn't have a real commanding pedigree, who doesn't have a real expectation, that the organization does not have grand plans for you. Most of the time, if you're not one of those high-end draft picks, if you're not a first-round guy, if you're not a day two guy at the top of that second round, your development is kind of secondary. That teams care. Your team obviously cares enough because they drafted you. They saw something in you. But those are not guys who are going to get priority in the development cycle. And there are other factors to consider. Where does the coach's vision for the team fit with the general manager's vision for the team? Is this going to be like a Moneyball situation where the general manager is going to have to get rid of guys from the team so the coach will play the team as it's supposed to be constructed? I can attest, as somebody who had David Quinn as the coach of his favorite hockey team for 3 seasons, David Quinn did not always play the roster the way the general manager wanted it to be played. And there were times where he just outright got rid of players because he did not like the way that David Quinn was running things. And Emberson did not play a lot last year. His time on ice, total time on ice, like the 7th or 8th most of any defenseman on the Sharks. And granted, the Sharks, as not a good team, are more liable to go through a variety of players than a quality team. You know, the better a team is, the less likely they are to change their lineup. So played the 4th or 5th most average time on ice, depending on the game, behind Ferraro, Thrun, Jan Ruda, Kyle Burrows, and Shakir Mokhmadoulan. Mokhmadoulan had less than 10 games, so that's kind of why we do things like rate stats to compare. So, special teams does not play power play at all. Ty Emberson, no 10 seconds of power play time averaged last season, a minute or so of penalty kill time per average time on ice per game, about a minute or so of penalty kill time. So if he's going to take that CC or Desharnais spot on the Oilers penalty kill, he's going to have to probably take on a bit more work than he's used to. Last season, 43% of his ice time against middle six competition, 32% of the time against elite competition, and 24% against fourth liners. Against fourth liners, decent results, 48% of the dangerous scoring chances. Against elite competition, 46% of the dangerous scoring chances. And against average middle six players, 36% of the dangerous scoring chances. The lowest of the three categories, but also the most ice time, 43% versus 32%. Deployed most often with a forward group comprised of Anthony Duclair, Mike Hoffman, and Tomas Hertl. I do think it's notable that the Sharks, different from the Oilers, the Sharks put their best offensive forwards out there with their weakest defensemen to try and balance it out, whereas the Oilers, they're not doing hard match. They're just trying to get Bouchard and McDavid out there the most as they possibly can. I'll be curious to see how Emberson does if he is playing with lower in the lineup guys like Henrique, like Connor Brown, like Corey Perry. He does have strong defensive results. Again, I want to reiterate, 30 games is not a large sample size for determining how good a player is. But the fact that the Sharks, as bad as they are defensively, or I should say were last season, the fact that Emberson was able to have strong defensive impacts, 12% lower than league average for expected goals against, that's nothing to sneeze at. That is strong defensive impact. And I do want to add a caveat to that they were below average offensively with Emberson out there on the ice. But the idea for a guy like Emberson, who's going to be on a third pair, is low event hockey. That means no scoring chances in both directions. That means preventing scoring chances from even being feasibly generated in the neutral zone, preventing the other team from going from defense to offense. It means forcing the other team to dump the puck in, so Emberson has to turn around, go and get it to his partner. His partner can move it out of the zone. That's the idea here when we're talking about somebody like Emberson, and why, even though these results are over a small period of time, I do think they are somewhat interesting and show the capabilities that the Oilers see something here. And I was going to say this in the first segment, but I didn't get a chance to because I ran long talking about the criteria. But in a vacuum, the most important things in your evaluation of a player, number one, first person scouting. If you are there in person or able to watch the tape, that is the most valuable thing you can do. Number two, you want to have the statistical background to understand how a player's playing, to be able to refer back to specific areas of a player's game. We're going to talk about microstats, transition stats in the next segment, how they might translate to the Oilers, who are a good transition team. But you want to marry the eye test to the advanced statistics, so scoring chances, expected goals, high danger chances, and you want to marry that to your transition stats. And then you want to read other people's. You want to read secondary source accounts of a player's evaluation. You want to read the clips. You want to go into what people have written about a player, whether it's a scouting service, whether it's something like Elite Prospects, which is kind of in between a scouting service and a media publication. You want to read any relevant media any relevant media about a player. You want to watch any relevant media about a player. But when we're talking about somebody like a Ty Emberson, who's a 6th or 7th defenseman, who's playing on a not good team, there's not going to be as much there's not going to be as much data, there's not going to be as much media, as much information as there would be about somebody who's a highly touted prospect. So that's why we're going to lean on the stats here a little bit more than we typically would for a player I was a bit more familiar with. If I was to do this about Cody Ceci, I would be able to point out relevant game clips. If we were talking about Darnell Nurse, I would be able to point to specific instances. Somebody like Emberson, if you're going to crunch the tape, it's going to be a grind. But we're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about his transition stats, how that might fit in Edmonton, and realistically, what are feasible expectations for Ty Emberson's first season as an Oiler. Coming up on this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everybody who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. We're getting there, friends. We are not quite in the home stretch, but 3 weeks or so till preseason testing, then preseason games, then the actual season, and we have tangible hockey to talk about. We can analyze whether or not the Oilers' bottom six is good enough. We can talk about guys like Emberson and Troy Stecher, how they're acclimating to their first real taste of consistent playing time for the first time in their respective NHL careers. Well, in Stecher's case, first time in a while on a good team to be playing top 4 minutes. But you get what I'm saying. We are in the analysis, and we're looking forward now. A lot of this summer has been about analyzing what's happened so far, what's happened last season, how we got to this point. Now, we're at a point where we can start looking forward. We can start gauging what are expectations for this season. How do we understand what this team's shape is going to be, what they want to do offensively, defensively, in net, what the coaching staff wants to do, all of it. And that's where we can start to have fun, because that's where we can analyze whether or not the Oilers' suppositions as a team are working. If something isn't working, if the wins and losses aren't, if the wins aren't there, we can look and determine, well, who's the weak link? Why is this player not performing? Is this a case of somebody just struggling, or is this who they are? So with that in mind, we can tackle Emberson's the last component of this evaluation. To me, and we talked about this in the first segment, the most important thing is positioning. Are you where you need to be when you need to be there? For somebody like Emberson, who is a puck retriever, who is big-bodied, you need to be at the net front and you need to be below the goal line. If he is playing with Brett Kulak, neither of those guys is a great puck mover. They're not going to be mistaken for an Evan Bouchard. They're not going to be whipping that puck around, getting it where it needs to go. They're going to be doing the lunge pail hard hat defenseman bit. They are going to be in the corners. They're going to be getting the puck and trying to get it to a forward to bail them out. So the last component here, when we're talking about his transition skills, he's a below average skater. If you look at the NHL Edge tools, the player tracking database, he's below the 50th percentile in all the skating components. And these transition stats, I want to say they do have the caveat of him being on a really bad team. So I will be curious to see if the Oilers can get better results from him in transition than the Sharks did. So more failed exits and a lower than average number of puck retrievals that eventually led to exits. So when the other team got the puck into the Shark zone, Emberson failed to exit the zone more than average, and he had a lower than average number of retrievals that ultimately led to exits. He has a high rate of clears, which means rimming the puck along the boards or alley-ooping it out of the zone. He had a lower than average number of retrievals that led to clean exits. That high rate of clears and lower than average rates of exits with control, think of it like this. Do you think when this player gets the puck, they are going to lob it out and pray the puck goes where it needs to go? Or are they going to make a crisp pass or skate the puck out of danger? That is how we're evaluating a defenseman's ability in transition. And then the last component, he's conservative at his own blue line. The other team does carry the puck in against him at a high rate. That makes sense. He's not particularly strong of a skater. He's probably going to take a deeper posture defensively at his own blue line. He's going to be more inclined to skate backwards towards his own net as opposed to pressuring a guy at a blue line and trying to speed them up into making a decision, because he doesn't have the recovery speed of a faster defenseman. You know, somebody who can gamble because they have the foot speed to make up for it is going to be inclined to be a bit more aggressive and force the other team to move the puck as opposed to carrying it in. So I view Emberson as a upside play. I view him as somebody that, if things break right, if the Oilers are able to protect his role, give him easy minutes, he should be functional. If he gets opportunity with higher end players, whether that's Kulak, whether that's Ekholm, I don't think that is particularly what I'm thinking about. I am putting it more in terms of, can he get an occasional shift with Draisaitl, Nuge, and Skinner? Can he get an occasional shift with McDavid? And in that environment where those guys are going to be leading the transition play, they're going to receive the puck, skate it out, and go. I think that's where somebody like Emberson has potential. His defensive results are promising on a bad team. I don't want to put too much of an expectation on somebody like Emberson just because who he is as a player at this point. You know, at 24 years old, after 6 years of developmental, after being drafted, 3 in college, 3 in the AHL, you would typically have more of an understanding who a player is at this point. And that's not a knock. There are late bloomers, especially at that defenseman position where they have to kind of figure out how they're going to adapt their game to higher levels of hockey the further along they go. That is real. That is entirely real. But I think it's also fair to say that at 24 years old, you would like a little bit more of an understanding of who a player is. We have 30 games to evaluate him and project where he's going to be. That is not an adequate sample size. So I think if you were to describe him at the outset, he is a developmental player who has potential upside, but the expectation should not be that high. It's really that simple. If he is a NHL caliber sixth defenseman, that's a win. Anything more than that for the Oilers is gravy. And I know there are going to be people, and I talked about this the other day on Liberty Blue, my Rangers podcast, but my partner, Andrew, he disagreed. I said that even though CC is probably a worse player, his experience, his skating ability, in spite of his lack of puck skills or positioning or hockey IQ, with all of that intertwined, I do think there's an argument that the devil might be better off on a team that has such high expectations, because the Oilers are not in a position where they can afford to give Emberson a lot of room to make mistakes. The expectation for Emberson is you come in, you play low risk hockey, you stay in the lineup, and then come deadline time, we might replace you with somebody better, and then we slide Troy Stetcher down, and you're an occasional guy, and you're a 7th D. If that's the profile you think for Emberson, you're going to be reasonable. But don't expect him to come in and hit the ground running. I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. You think about the environment he went from in San Jose last year, a 19-win team, to the Cup favorite, the preseason Cup favorite the following season. There's going to be an adjustment period. The Oilers are better situated to cover for his mistakes because the roster is talented, but he does eventually need to play. He eventually is liable for his own play, and that's how we're going to determine who he is. But on paper, I see the vision the Oilers are looking for and what they think they can get from him. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. It helps other people find the show. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, leave me a comment. Do you think Ty Emberson will be a playoff starter by the next postseason, by the time we finish this regular season? Do you think he has played his way into the Oilers' top 6 permanently, or do you think he will be replaced at the trade deadline? Let me know in the comments. And before we get out of here, I got to tell everyone thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. Go check out Locked On NHL, where the season never ends and provides national expertise with a local flavor. You can find the link to Locked On NHL in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hunter Hodes and I will be tackling the top 10 wingers in hockey on Thursday's edition tomorrow. Shameless plug. Talk to you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.